The day Monica died, the world seemed to pause. Augustine and his friends stood in silence, their hearts heavy with a grief they couldn't quite name. Monica, Augustine's mother, had always been the anchor of their lives. She was the woman who, in her final moments, showed a strength and faith that left everyone in awe. But it wasn't just her passing that stunned them. It was the way she faced death, with a calmness that seemed almost otherworldly. "Why do you weep for me?" she had asked, her voice steady. "I am going to a better place, to be with the Lord." Her words cut through the sorrow, reminding them that her life was not defined by the earthly bonds of family, but by her deep, unshakable faith. Augustine's father, Patricius, had died 2 years earlier, and the memory of his passing was a distant, almost forgotten pain. But Monica's death was different. She was the heart of their small community, the one who had held them all together. Her death marked a turning point, not just for Augustine, but for the entire group of friends who had become more than just companions. They had become a family of faith. In the early days, Augustine's family had been a source of conflict and confusion. His father, Patricius, was a man of the world, more concerned with social status and wealth than with spiritual matters. His mother, Monica, on the other hand, was a devout Christian who spent her life praying for her son's conversion. Augustine himself was caught in the middle, torn between the world's temptations and the call of God. But as Augustine's journey of faith began, his understanding of family changed. The traditional family, with its ties of blood and marriage, gave way to a new kind of family, a family of the Spirit. This new family was not bound by the laws of the world, but by the love of God. Augustine's closest friends became his brothers and sisters in Christ, and the church became their true home. One of the most significant moments in this transformation was the appearance of Bishop Ambrose in Augustine's life. Ambrose was more than just a spiritual leader. He was a mentor and a friend. Through Ambrose, Augustine found a deeper connection to the Christian community, and his friends Alypius, Nebridius, and others became his true family. They shared a common purpose, a common faith, and a common vision of a life lived in service to God. In the quiet moments after Monica's death, Augustine and his friends gathered to pray. They sang psalms and remembered the woman who had taught them so much about faith and love. Monica's final words echoed in their minds. "Nothing is far from God, and it is not to be feared that he does not know where to resurrect me at the end of time." Her words were a reminder that their bond, their family, was not defined by the physical world, but by the eternal love of God. As the days turned into weeks, Augustine and his friends continued to support each other. They shared their struggles and their triumphs, their doubts and their faith. They were no longer just a group of individuals. They were a family, bound together by their shared journey towards God. In this new family, Augustine found a sense of belonging that he had never known before. The traditional family, with its hierarchies and expectations, had been replaced by a community of equals, united by their love for God and for each other. This was a family that transcended the limits of the world, a family that pointed towards the eternal city of God, where all would be united in perfect love and perfect peace. As Augustine looked around at his friends, he knew that their journey was just beginning. The road ahead was uncertain, but they would face it together as a family. And in that moment, he felt a peace that he had never felt before, a peace that came from knowing that, no matter what the future held, they were not alone. They were a family, and they were home. In the time after the Roman Empire fell in the West, the way people thought about their families stayed a lot like it was in the old days. People saw their families as part of bigger groups, like towns and churches. Families weren't separate, but always connected to other parts of society. When big changes happened in the world, like the fall of the empire, these changes affected how people saw their families and treated their relatives. To understand how people thought about family, we need to look at the documents from that time. We have a lot of religious writings like stories of saints, rules for monks, and letters from church leaders. We also have some history books written by priests, and documents from kings and rulers. These documents are more common from the post-Roman period than from the Roman period, which helps us see more about how people lived. However, it's hard to see the full picture of family life, because most of the documents we have are religious. We don't have many personal letters or records of daily life. This makes it tricky to understand how families were organized, or how they interacted with each other. One way historians try to solve this problem is by creating detailed family trees using bits of information from different sources. This can help us see how people were connected, but it's not always perfect. Sometimes the family trees show gaps or missing information, which means we can't be sure about everything. Instead of trying to force the documents into a specific family structure, it might be better to look at how people in that time thought about family. For example, the letters of bishops, like Sidonius Apollinaris, can give us a lot of information about how families coped with the changes in their world. Sidonius Apollinaris was a bishop in Clermont in the late 5th century. One time he was traveling back home from Lyons and saw some workers digging near a cemetery. He was worried they might be disturbing his grandfather's grave, so he rode his horse into the cemetery and confronted them. He was so upset that he had the workers punished and then wrote a letter to his nephew, Secundus, telling him to fix the tomb and put a nice stone with an inscription on it. This story might seem like a classic example of Roman respect for ancestors, where grandsons and great-grandsons take care of their family's graves. However, the fact that Sidonius only noticed the problem by accident shows that he hadn't been thinking about it much. The cemetery was in bad shape, with old ashes scattered around and graves flattened by the weather. Sidonius had been neglecting his duties to his grandfather, and he felt guilty about it. In the letter to Secundus, Sidonius wrote a poem about his grandfather, who had been a prefect, a high-ranking government official, and a wise and generous man. But the most important thing about his grandfather, according to Sidonius, was that he was the first in his family to become a Christian. This shows how the idea of family was changing. While Sidonius still respected his grandfather's Roman achievements, he thought the most important thing was his grandfather's Christian faith. Earlier, in a letter to his friend Philomadius, Sidonius talked about his ambition to become a prefect, inspired by his father, grandfather, and great-grandfather, who had all held important positions. He was proud of his family's history of service and wanted to follow in their footsteps. However, this focus on family achievements was more about personal ambition than a strict family line. Sidonius and his friends didn't think of family in a rigid, genealogical way. They were more concerned with their friends and the people they knew well, whether or not they were related by blood. For example, Sidonius's father wasn't buried near his grandfather, and Sidonius himself was buried in a church in his wife's hometown, not his own. This shows that family connections were more about personal relationships and friendships than a strict family line. Sidonius was very close to his wife, Papianilla, and her family. He preferred her home to his own family's estate, and was more interested in her family's history. He even included his father-in-law, who had been an emperor, in the list of important family members. This shows that family wasn't just about blood relations, but about the people who were important in your life. In the end, the way people thought about family in the post-Roman period was complex and flexible. It wasn't about rigid family lines, but about the people you knew and the relationships you had. This makes it harder to create neat family trees, but it helps us understand how people lived and thought about their families in a time of great change. Sidonius Apollinaris lived in a time when family connections and the friendships that came from them were very important. His letters and poems show us how he thought about family and the people he cared about. When his brother-in-law Ecdicius was made a patrician, which was a very high honor, Sidonius wrote to his sister Papianilla to tell her how proud he was. He said that Ecdicius's new title made their whole family more respected. He also talked about the deep friendship that connected Sidonius, Papianilla, and Ecdicius. For Sidonius, family and friendship were closely linked. He hoped that their children would continue this friendship and even make it stronger, just as he and his sister had done. Sidonius also wrote a letter to a friend named Aper, encouraging him to remember his mother's side of the family as well as his father's. He believed that everyone should appreciate both parents equally, even though in his time, people often focused more on the father's side. Sidonius talked about Aper's hometowns and the people who had helped raise him, like his maternal grandparents, Fronto and Auspicia, and his aunt, Frontina. He described the beauty of the Auvergne, where Aper's mother's family was from, and urged Aper to return there. For Sidonius, the place where someone grew up and the people who helped raise them were just as important as blood relation. Sidonius himself was deeply connected to the Auvergne through his wife, Papianilla, and her family. He wrote more about his wife's family than his own, which suggests that the connections he made through marriage were just as important to him as those through birth. When it came to his own family, Sidonius had close relationships with his paternal uncles, Simplicius, Apollinaris, and Thaumastus. However, he didn't always make it clear exactly how they were related. For example, he called Apollinaris his brother, but this term could mean a close friend as well as a blood relative. He also talked about his tie of blood with Thaumastus, but it's not always clear if he meant this literally. Sidonius's letters show that the bonds of friendship were just as important as those of family, and sometimes even more so. In his letters, Sidonius often talked about the love and friendship he had with his relatives and friends. For example, he wrote to Simplicius about their friendship and how much he valued it. To Apollinaris, he expressed his affection and true love, emphasizing the importance of their relationship. Even with his cousin Probus, who was technically in a fine a relative by marriage, Sidonius felt a deep connection, saying that their bond was like a brotherhood because they had grown up together and shared the same experiences. Sidonius's network of friends was built on shared experiences, like going to school together, playing games, and working in the same political circles. These friendships were just as important as blood relations, and sometimes even more so. He believed that the friendships and alliances of one generation could be passed down to the next, just like the honors and dignities that came with them. When Sidonius became a bishop in 469–70, his life and his relationships changed. He had to give up some of his old ways and focus on his new role in the church. His letters from this time show a shift from the flamboyant, worldly life he had before to a more serious, religious one. He still wrote to his old friends and family, but the tone of his letters became more dignified and less playful. He also started writing to other bishops and priests, emphasizing their spiritual pedigrees rather than their worldly one. Despite these changes, Sidonius still valued his old relationships. The first letters in his books were often addressed to his closest family and friends, showing that these connections remained important to him. However, his new role as a bishop meant that he had to navigate a different set of norms and expectations. He had to defend his choices and actions, especially when it came to selecting new bishops, by emphasizing their moral and spiritual qualities rather than their birth and social status. Sidonius's life and his letters show us how family, friendship, and the changing times influenced his sense of identity and his relationship. Whether as a secular noble or a bishop, he always believed in the power of close connections and the importance of nurturing them. Sidonius Apollinaris, a Roman aristocrat from the late 5th century, found himself in a world that was rapidly changing. The Roman Empire, which had once been the bedrock of his identity and status, was crumbling, and with it, the old social structures that defined his life. Sidonius, who had always been proud of his noble lineage and the ranks of dignities he and his friends held, now faced a new reality. He had to adapt, and this transformation is beautifully captured in his letters. After becoming a bishop, Sidonius's letters took on a new tone. They were filled with nostalgia for the past, a time when he and his friends, like Magnus Felix and Polmius, were part of the elite. These friends, who once shared a world of shared prestige and power, now seemed distant. Sidonius tried to rekindle these old friendships, reminding Polmius and Magnus Felix of their old intimacy and the bonds of their families. However, the world had moved on. The Visigoths were consolidating their power, and the old Roman prefecture was no more. Polmius, for example, might have felt that it was time to forge new alliances, ones that would be more useful in the new political landscape. Sidonius's letters to friends like Simplicius, Apollinaris, and Thaumastus were some of his most poignant, written as these friendships were fading. He even wrote to his nephew Secundus about his grandfather's tomb, which had been desecrated. This personal loss symbolized the broader disintegration of the Roman world in Gaul. The old props that had defined his identity, the ranks of dignities and the prefecture, were gone, and Sidonius had to remake himself. In his new role as a bishop, Sidonius's identity shifted. He began to emphasize his Christian piety more than his noble lineage. He wrote about figures like Vettius, a model Christian aristocrat who lived a life of self-control and devotion. Sidonius admired Vettius for his ability to balance the demands of the secular world with a deep spiritual life. This was a new ideal for Sidonius, one that reflected the changing times. Sidonius also tried to recruit his peers into the church. He wrote to Ferriolus, a fellow aristocrat, encouraging him to consider the episcopacy. Sidonius argued that the lowest religious person was counted among the greatest secular honors. This was a significant shift in his thinking, reflecting the new value system that was emerging in post-Roman Gaul. The church was becoming the new center of power, and bishops were the new leaders. Sidonius's transformation was not just personal, but also generational. His son, Apollinaris, and his grandson, Leontius, followed in his footsteps and became bishops. This trend was not unique to Sidonius's family. Many other aristocratic families, like the Ruriciae and the Avidi, also entered the episcopacy. This movement has been seen as a way for the old Roman aristocracy to maintain their influence in a changing world. The episcopacy became a new form of nobility, one that combined traditional aristocratic values with Christian piety. However, it's important to note that the transition was not seamless. Not all bishops came from the old Roman aristocracy. In fact, only a small percentage of bishops in the 5th and 6th centuries can be firmly identified as senators. This suggests that the path to the episcopacy was more open than previously thought, and that kinship and family ties were not always the determining factors. Ruricius of Limoges and Avitus of Vienne, who became bishops later than Sidonius, were more thoroughly imbued with the Christian ethos. Their letters, unlike Sidonius's, were mostly addressed to other bishops and religious figures. They used kinship terms like frater brother and pater father to express spiritual bonds, reflecting the new ecclesiastical community they were part of. These terms were not just about blood relations, but were used to convey deep, affectionate ties within the church. In the end, Sidonius's journey from a Roman aristocrat to a Christian bishop is a microcosm of the broader transformation of Gaul. The old world of Roman dignity and prefectures gave way to a new world of Christian piety and ecclesiastical power. Sidonius and his contemporaries had to navigate this change, redefining their identities and their relationships in the process. Their letters, filled with nostalgia and new ideals, are a testament to this remarkable transition. In this chapter, we explore how the people of late antique times, like Ruricius, Sidonius, and Avitus, thought about family and relationships. You might think that the words they used to talk about family meant the same things as they do today, but that's not always the case. In their world, words like father, brother, and sister were more about feelings and the bonds they shared, rather than just who was related by blood. The word consanguines is a fancy term that means of the same blood. But even though it sounds like it should be used a lot to talk about family, it wasn't. In all the letters and poems of Ruricius, Sidonius, and Avitus, it only appears 5 times. Sometimes it was used to talk about fish catching fish, or to describe a relationship between different tribes, or even to discuss religious ideas. But it wasn't a common word for talking about family. For these writers, the words pater father, frater brother, mater mother, and soror sister were used much more often and carried more meaning. These words weren't just about who was related by blood. They were about the love and closeness people felt for each other. For example, when Ruricius talked about his brother, he wasn't always talking about a biological brother. He might have been talking about a close friend, a fellow priest, or someone he felt a deep spiritual connection with. Isidore of Seville, a smart man who wrote about the meanings of words, explained that a father was someone who started a family line and governed his household with love. A genitor was more like a sperm donor, someone who just helped create a child. Brothers and sisters could mean people who shared the same parents, but they could also mean people who shared the same beliefs or were part of the same community. Ruricius, one of these letter writers, had a family, but it wasn't always easy to figure out who was related to whom. He had sons and grandsons and a wife named Hiberia, but he never talked about her in his letters. He might have had brothers named Leontius and Celsus, but it's not clear if they were really his brothers by blood. When he called Celsus his brother, he might have meant that Celsus was his best friend, someone he felt a deep spiritual connection with. The way Ruricius and his friends used words like brother shows us that family wasn't just about who was born to the same parents. It was about the love, trust, and support they shared. They used these words to build a community of people who cared for each other, whether they were related by blood or not. So, when we read the letters and poems of Ruricius, Sidonius, and Avitus, we see that family was more than just a group of people who shared the same gene. It was a network of relationships built on love, trust, and shared beliefs. This helps us understand how these people lived and how they thought about the world around them.